So we've both cycled down from Wood to the beautifully named Hobbyhorse Wood, and doesn't seem like there's a definitive reason why it's called Hobbyhorse Wood, but if anybody knows, we would love to hear from you. And we're here to talk about different tree species, leaves falling on us as we speak. So run through some classic indicators of different types of trees.
Well, I mean, this is Hobbyhorse Wood, and it's much smaller than Wood, and it's old woodland that's been replanted with a number of different species. And so it's quite a nice little compact place to come and do a bit of learning about tree ID or practicing your tree ID. And tree IDing in summer is all about looking at the leaves, really.
Okay.
The actual overall form of the tree varies so much on the age of the tree and the environment it's growing in. So an oak tree can be a tiny sapling, or it can be a very tall straight tree, or in the right circumstances a huge wide spreading tree. So the shape of the tree doesn't help you much, but the leaves are more or less always the same, whatever the size and age of the tree. And it's partly about just looking at the shape of the leaf, but there's other things you need to pay attention to as well. So if you have a look at that leaf, what does that feel to you?
It feels slightly velvety on
Yeah,
top.
yeah, it's kind of felty, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they're tiny little hairs on the leaf which help with deterring insect pests and change the water loss on the leaf. And contrast that with...
yes, yeah, so glossy, smooth, and obviously, you know, just the shape. This one's got
a bit of a different shape,
smoother edge, whereas this is more feathered. So.
And so the velvety is hazel. That's very characteristic of hazel, and that shiny leaf is a beech leaf. And this leaf's very similar shape to the beech leaf.
And there's just birch.
That's hornbeam, and if you look at the edge, there are tiny little teeth along the edge of the leaf.
Yeah, you can feel them as you drag your finger around.
Yeah, whereas the beech leaf is smooth.
So I'm familiar with seeing hornbeams on the streets of London. Basically, that's where you see them, because they're in isolation. They're quite majestic trees, but you'll find them in the woodlands around here as well.
Yeah, hornbeam is a specialist tree really of the southeast. It was one of the last trees to recolonise the UK after the last ice age, and it never really got much further north than the south of the country. But you get a lot of hornbeam woods in Hertfordshire because it's a really hard wood, very high calorific value, not rots easily, so not useful for making things outside, but traditionally was the wood used for burning and making charcoal. So a lot of the hornbeam woods around here were coppiced, and the wood was a fuel sent to the London markets.
Okay, and I'm showing my ignorance here because I've just talked about seeing hornbeams, and actually what I meant was plane trees.
Oh, the planes.
You see in London.
Yeah.
Which definitely weren't burnt because they were used for their kind of robust.
Yeah, the plane trees are an introduced species. They're not a native species, but they're an introduced species, like many of the species we got, like horse chestnut and sweet chestnut. But they're a very successful city tree because they have that beautiful kind of camouflage effect bark, which picks up the pollutants from the city, but then it sheds the bark, so it loses the pollutants, and that's how it thrives so much in a city environment.
That's amazing. And within an environment like this, you talk about sort of native trees and then trees that have been introduced. What's the sort of percentage makeup of native versus introduced?
In terms of numbers of trees, in most things like Wood, it will be a high proportion of native trees with the odd introduced tree.
Right.
And that will be in most places. Parks and gardens, it's much more weighted towards introduced trees.
Sure, yeah.
And then of course you've got plantations, commercial plantations. You can get a whole forest of introduced species. But in most, although you have a few introduced species like these majestic conifers, these Douglas fir. You'll have a few introduced species, but they'll mostly be native species in terms of the numbers.
Sure. And do any of these species actually require more maintenance and management than others, or are they generally kind of self-preserving and they're going to look after themselves?
I don't think any species need more looking after than others. The health of the wood often depends on giving some of the bigger trees room to get even bigger.
Yeah.
So even when you're not managing these woods for timber production, you'll still maybe be thinning them out a little bit just to encourage some of the trees to grow.
Yeah, and
to grow
some
into
of this
big
new
trees.
growth like that we've got here.
Yeah, and yeah, you'll encourage in the right place at the right time some the new growth. Yeah.
Brilliant, fantastic. And how old is this woodland? Is this sort of still talking about the same sort of heritage as ancestry as Balls Wood?
I don't know specifically for this wood, but many of these Hertfordshire woods, you know, are hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
The ancient woodland is, or semi-natural ancient woodland is defined as woodland that was wooded in 1600, because if it was wooded in 1600, it was probably been wooded for a long time before that,
Sure.
because people weren't planting woods before that date. And semi-natural because almost all the woods, particularly in this part of England, have had some sort of meddling from man over the years. None of them are completely wild spaces.
Well, one of the things you do notice in here is actually, I mean, yes, it's got a little bit cloudier, but there is a substantial drop in temperature as you come underneath the cooling canopy, and it really is on a hot sunny day. It's a lovely space to be in. So dapple sunlight, beautiful environment. So excellent. Thank you very much for thank you very much for these. I will try and remember which one's which.
You can keep them.
Thank you.